Hello and welcome. I have with me today Paul Hill. Paul, will you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us about what you do as a career?
Okay. I live in Los Angeles, California. I work in the entertainment business. I work for Technicolor, which is a company with a very broad and storied history in the entertainment business. Um, Currently, Technicolor has operations in many countries around the world and include all levels of production, post production. They also have a zillion patents. They are in the invention business, and right now they are working on a new version of television for us all to enjoy called HDR television. Very active in that. And what I do for them is visual effects. I work at their post production facility in Hollywood at the Sunset Gower Studios, and I've been with them for 13 years. I was actually with a company that they bought called Complete Post. Actually, it was the other way around. The company that owned Complete Post bought Technicolor at the time. So, but now we're all Technicolor, and yeah, that's pretty much where I've been for a while.
Very, very cool. Thank you for that. So, what is involved in your daily work, and in what way do words matter in your job?
Mm. Um, there are like three different ways that language is super important to what we do. One is like any industry, any business. I mean, like today I'm watching football and I'm thinking about our interview, and I'm thinking about how every subset of business entertainment has its own language. And I'm realizing I'm listening to the NFL coverage, and I'm realizing that if somebody just came into the room who had never seen a football game before, they would not understand the language that was going on. The same is true of many professions, and mine is no exception. The first thing I had to do was learn the lingo, the electronic technical lingo for what it is that's done in post production, and I had to learn that early on. Just to be able to communicate, just to be able to learn what I had to learn
Hmm.
for my career. And I did that with the help of tech manuals, mentors, and just listening, keeping my ears open, asking lots of questions. And once you learn the language, it's just like a foreign language in a way. It's like once you start to learn the language, you get better and better at speaking it and understanding it, and you don't have to ask as many questions. But the other thing, the more important thing is that you're working with clients who don't necessarily need to know your language, but you need to be able to communicate to them what it is they need to know to get their job done.
Hmm.
Um, they don't have to know the technical side really at all. I mean, it helps if they do, but they don't have to. And that's where my job comes in, because I work directly with clients in a room,
Okay.
and they're expecting me to get a job done for them. And whether they can communicate with me uh, in a technical way or not can't matter. They have to be able. I have to be able to translate it for them. I have to be able to say they have to tell me what they want, and then I have to convert that
Hmm.
into action. I have to also be able to communicate with them in a social manner,
Mm.
because part of what my job is, sitting in a room with clients behind me, is also adding a social element so that they're comfortable and feel good about being in the room. And so it's like that's the kind of thing that I'm
Wow.
balancing, keeping the technical going and keeping the social going, and having a good time, making
Right.
it as fun for everybody as possible. That was number three.
That's
Sorry.
that's that's actually very interesting that you point that out. I mean, you're in the entertainment business, so part of that is it's a service oriented business,
Yes.
right? So being able to cater to what they need, but also making them very comfortable to be working with you,
Yes.
and feeling that they can rely on you, but also have a connection, which would be very important.
Right. Which in our business is very important
Right.
because you want repeat customers. You
Right.
want them to think of you first when they have another job.
Right. Definitely. So, what do you read as part of your job, and what processes do you use for going through these readings?
Okay, as far as the readings go, it's actually these days it's a combination of reading and watching,
Hmm.
because now with the advent of podcasts and YouTube and so on and so forth, it's not just a matter of reading. I've always read the trade journals. I've always read the entertainment magazines. Even when I started in Ohio, I was reading the magazines for post production and looking at the Los Angeles market. This was like a window into the Los Angeles market, which is still one of the biggest markets in the world for what I do, and thinking as I was sitting in Cleveland that, maybe someday, I'll be out there and I'll be experiencing all these things because all the cutting edge stuff was happening.
Sure.
Chicago, LA, London. Uh, so I still read those magazines. There are many trade magazines that are still printed, and a few of them have gone online only. There are Facebook groups now, and as far as training for what I do, the internet has become invaluable because I used to just read training manuals that came with software
Right.
or equipment, and those were written by people who not didn't necessarily know how to communicate with us.
Uh-huh.
They were written by engineers who developed the software or who created the hardware, and they didn't know exactly how to explain to us how we might use this in a practical way. Now, what we have with the internet is that we have companies who hire communication people to look at what has been developed by the software and hardware people and figure out a way to communicate that to us, the users, and how we can use that in our day-to-day work, which is incredibly valuable because not just to us, but to them, because they broaden their user base
Right.
by making it obvious what it is they intended. If they just put it out there and waited for somebody to figure out what they had in mind, well, who knows? That might not ever happen. But now it's really quick. It's like when there's a new version of software. A new version of software just came out last week for the program that I use. And the day it was released, there was a series of videos on their website on what the new features were, how to use them, and so on and so forth. So
There's definitely been a big shift, and I agree with you, from that one-way communication of education to a more interactive, not just between the developer of the content, but also the users of the content.
correct.
So these online forums, whether they're user groups or meetups in real life, they're definitely making an impact in how people learn. And for a
Yeah.
professional such as yourself and myself, it definitely comes in handy in creating those connections again. We go back to the social aspect and having a bit more context when it comes to understanding how the software behaves in a certain situation and how you can manipulate it to get your own outcome. So it's very interesting that you point out that blend between the manufacturer specific uses and then what the user can then do with it and how
Yeah.
it gets out in the community.
Yeah, and
Incredible.
you mentioned user groups, which I neglected to mention that there is a big user group for the software that I use as well, and they meet in LA.
Okay.
Yeah, they just started meetups again last year, and now they're doing it like 4 times a year. We used to just see that one time a year, and we had to fly to Vegas to get it. So it's really, really been helpful to have these 4 meetings a year and have other users demonstrate what they've done, and so we can see their work and get ideas from that.
So now there's no excuse to go to Vegas, huh?
Yeah, there really isn't. As a matter of fact, for the convention itself that I used to attend, which is NAB, the National Association of Broadcasters, the last few times I did attend, it was almost entirely for social reasons. I started going in early. I started going on Friday. The convention always started on Monday. I started going on Friday and basically filling my calendar with social events, meet and greets, and so on and so forth. And then Monday, I would spend a few hours on the floor and then go straight for the airport and come home.
Right.
Because especially now on Monday morning of that convention, I turn on my computer. There are live presentations everywhere.
Right.
And so I pick the ones I want to see and I can cache the ones that I want to watch later. And it's just like watching the convention on television and without having to go to Vegas, which for me anyway is fine.
Sure, sure. And that networking aspect is very important, especially in your industry, but also being very selective in the content that you want to go and you get it on demand, right?
Yes.
You're able to learn on your schedule and on your terms, which is fantastic.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about what you read and the processes that you use or the communities that you're a part of. So with that in mind, if you were to interview a candidate for a job, what demands for reading and writing would you expect her or him to know that are specific to your type of work?
Well, I would expect them to. I don't know if I could insist that they do a certain amount of this or that, but I would expect them to have the interest in their profession to at least attempt. I mean, technical manuals are still very difficult to read,
Mm-hmm.
although they've gotten way better. But if somebody was genuinely interested in doing what I do, and I train a lot of people, and I can always tell the ones after a few visits, I can tell the ones that are going to be successful and the ones that aren't. And the ones that are the ones who are filling their spare time with reading the same things that I read. It's like if they come to me and they say, "Hey, you know what? I was just reading in this magazine that this guy did this really cool visual effects using this software that you use, and this is how they did it." I would say, "Wow, you're onto something," because if you did that in your spare time and you were interested enough, I mean, it shows me genuine interest. If you were interested enough to read that manual as a beginner, or not that manual, but that article as a beginner, then you have a genuine interest in this.
Mm-hmm.
You're not wasting time. You're not hoping that I'm going to provide some magic potion that you're going to just be able to slide over and do this. Then to me, that is a measure of genuine interest. And, that involves, reading and communicating and everything to prove that you are genuinely interested.
And part of that, I think, is also goes to the initiative that a person
Yes.
can have in getting the jump start on their career or anything. If you start off as a hobby, and I'm sure you might have a similar story where you were interested. You said you were, back out east, and you wanted to get here, and your interest drove you here. And I'm sure that it wasn't something that was just handed to you. You were willing to work for it, and you eventually ended up where you're at now because of that initiative.
Yeah, I had great mentors along the way, and a certain amount of my own ambition. You mix those together,
Yeah,
and yeah, it's really helpful.
very
But you're
awesome.
right. The funny thing about what I do now, it didn't exist
Uh huh.
at all in
Right.
this form. Visual effects were done completely on film when I was
Mm,
starting out. I
wow.
started out as a videotape editor,
Uh huh.
and the visual effects for television business was in its infancy, and it
Wow.
was still all being done on film,
Right.
which was a very cumbersome process. And by the time I arrived in Hollywood, it was just going through the transformation. And I
Sure.
worked at one of the first places in Hollywood that basically crossed that line and figured out a way to do high quality visual effects for television. And fortunately enough for me, it was on the show Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Oh, wow.
And
Great.
so I found myself as an assistant on that
Uh
show
huh.
to start. And then after a year and a half,
Uh huh.
I found myself actually doing visual effects for Star Trek, and yeah, I mean, it just all came together. But I've never forgotten the fact that what I do for a living now, I couldn't have dreamed of it.
Mm-hmm.
You can dream of being a
Sure.
musician and become a musician,
Right.
those kinds of things. But if I can't lie, this didn't exist
Exist.
when I was a kid. So
There are some statistics about that, and I'm not sure what the percentage is, but certain percentage of jobs that kids are going to have, when they graduate from high school, current generation don't even exist yet.
yeah,
So that's awesome, and those must have been such quite exciting times for you, getting to work on that show and learning that and being really on the innovative edge of that.
I got spoiled. I
Yeah.
definitely did. And then I was like addicted to it because I wanted to be on I wanted to be in every meeting. I wanted to be in
Sure.
on every conversation. I wanted to hear every word that was being said about this transformation from film to digital in the area of visual effects.
Well, it's
So,
interesting. Again, you said you wanted to be involved in all conversations, communication, you wanted to hear all the words, and that
yeah.
goes back to your ability to use your literacy skills to advance your own learning and your own placement in your career. So, with that in mind, what cognitive tasks are involved, such as synthesis? What are the demands of reading and writing for your job?
Okay. Well, what I need on a day-to-day basis on my job is from the client. I need them to have gone through. They go through their show and they determine what is and is not a visual effect that they're going to have to address. And they create an Excel spreadsheet for me and they provide that list to me. And then we sit together and go through that Excel spreadsheet.
Okay.
They have noted the point in the show where the shot is, what they think needs to happen in that shot in the description column. Um, and then what they think the time is that I'm going to need to complete that shot in their opinion.
Uh-huh.
Then we go through the show and we look at each one of those shots. Some of them we throw away because we realize that they don't need to be done. It's a continuity thing. Maybe
Sure.
it doesn't, nobody's going to notice. They don't have the money, whatever. They're trying to save money or so on. So we go through this Excel spreadsheet, and by the end of it, I produce a second version of the spreadsheet that has the shots that remain or the shots that we added, and then a revised estimate of how long I think every shot is going to take.
Oh, interesting.
And then now that we're on, Excel, or we also use Microsoft OneNote,
Hmm.
it becomes an interactive document. And so as we're working, I have that document up on my computer. As I complete a shot, I put down the number of hours it actually took. I, highlight it or indicate in some fashion that the shot is done. And then with Technicolor, that's the client side. And then with Technicolor, they produce, every day they produce a schedule. So that I know exactly what I'm doing and for whom. They also need to know how many hours we're expecting to commit to a particular client so that they can plan for their schedule.
Sure.
And that's really about it. I mean, we don't really have to read. Now, on Star Trek, I read the scripts. They
Okay.
provided me with scripts for every episode. Now that really doesn't happen much anymore. On Star Trek, we would read the scripts and we would actually talk about what we think were going to be visual effects in an episode.
Interesting.
But less and less. That happens less and less now.
Now, how does that affect your job, you think? Because you've had experience when you had to read the scripts, and now that you don't, do you find that there is some kind of difference in the context, perhaps, in the work that you do, or is it kind of you've had enough experience, you know what you're going for, you know what you're doing?
I think it's actually that the clients have become more sophisticated.
Ah,
Visual effects is such a big part now of everything. I mean,
mm-hmm.
I worked on a project called the Seinfeld remasters, where
Yes.
we redid the entire Seinfeld. This was about 5 years ago.
Uh-huh.
We remastered all of, well, no, it's actually more like 7 or 8 years ago now. But anyway, we took all of the Seinfeld series and
Uh-huh.
remastered them from the original film. And I did not work on the original series, but I worked on the high def remastering program. And we had to recreate every visual effect that was ever done for that show for every episode. We had the original episode as a reference, and then we went through and recreated them to the best. I mean, we used it as a guide, but because it was high def now and it was really pristine footage we were using, we were able to get much better results than they could back in the standard def days.
Wow.
No knock on them. They had to put out a Seinfeld episode a week.
Mm. Wow.
And I was shocked when I found out how many episodes of Seinfeld had, sometimes 100 visual effects in a
Uh-huh.
half-hour sitcom, which is
Wow.
really, back then, was like 21, 22 minutes
Right.
of material in a half an hour. One of the episodes that I worked on was an episode where Kramer goes to a Saab dealer and test drives a car. And the entire episode were green screen comps of Kramer and the guy from the dealership in a car.
Uh-huh.
And it took me days
Wow.
in high def. I mean, rendering time slower and all that kind of stuff, and so on and so forth. But I was also getting every little detail right, which they did not have. They just didn't have the time to take care of like all of those little things. So my point being is that when you see how much work there is in an episode of a show, it can be really daunting to think about. How you're going to get this all done, even in a sitcom.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for doing that work because I love that show, and they just released it on Hulu, I think about a month or two ago, and my wife and I have been watching it, so it's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Well, I think what. Actually, let me go back
Uh-huh.
because I think your question actually though was about scripts versus non-scripts.
yeah,
right?
just the context of it, just more of a general question. In your experience, back when you were doing Star Trek, you had the script, so did it provide more context to the work that you were doing versus now when you are not provided scripts?
Yes, and I was talking about how savvy the clients are
Uh-huh.
now as well. So the education on the client side. When we read the script, sometimes I would like fantasize about these visual effects sequences in Star Trek, and I was saying, "Oh, we could fly by this planet, and we could do this, and we could blow this up," and then you talk to the other people who had read the script, and they would say, "Well, budget, budget, budget. No, no,
Yeah.
no." But what we can do is B or C, and so the conversation would come from there. And then the other thing about Star Trek is that I got to go to the set often,
Oh, cool.
and I would get to see the execution of some of the material that I was then going to see later in the visual effects bay. And so that was a great interactive part of the Star Trek job. So you had the script, you actually got to come up with ideas. You got to bounce them off the other people
Okay.
on the show. You got to go to the set. So that was very, very, very rewarding. But the thing about now is that because visual effects are such a big part of everything, and like the Seinfeld episode I was using as an example, it's permeated everything in television. Even shows that you don't think have any visual effects in them have
Uh-huh.
dozens and dozens of shots, because there are other things that go on in visual effects now that didn't used to. They used to have to be very careful about how they shot things
Oh.
because they knew that they couldn't fix them necessarily later. It was either going to be
Oh.
prohibitively expensive or just not
Uh-huh.
possible.
Wow.
So now, because production costs are so high, they'll be a little looser on the set. And like in the case of one show that I work on called Banshee, for example,
Uh-huh.
they shoot with 3 cameras live in an action scene, for example. And they just go for it. I mean, they choreograph the scene, but oftentimes the second or third camera person
Sure.
is shot by the other camera person.
Wow.
And so I have to get rid of them.
Yeah.
And I have to either put something else on the set to block them,
Mm-hmm.
or I have to paint them out or whatever.
That's interesting.
But the clients now are so used to visual effects, it's become such a basic part of our language that they can look at an episode now and really do a lot of the work without them having to send me a script.
Interesting.
I don't have to read the scripts necessarily anymore. The clients are so savvy, they can look at us at the script themselves
Mm-hmm.
and the shooting, the dailies from the shoot, and kind of figure it out on their own.
It's very interesting that you mention that, because the limitations and the budgets and whatever it is has a big impact in what you do. And I remember, for lack of a better example, I remember watching a video of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It was like a documentary, and I think it was Bob Hoskins was talking about how when they were filming, he had to make sure that his fingers were closed if he was grabbing the rabbit's neck or whatever, because if they were separated, they had to go in there and paint in or digitize over the effect, and that would cost back then it was several thousands or hundred thousands of dollars to just do that inch and a half of animation.
Roger's neck.
Exactly. Yeah.
Then
So
put
it's-
Roger's neck in that space.
yeah, exactly. It's interesting that you mentioned that. So the clients have now become more savvy in that sense, at least, in being more direct with what they want.
Yes, exactly.
And
And the thing is that now they don't care as much about that hand, because we've gotten pretty good at doing things like that. So they throw caution to the wind a little bit more easily now than they used to.
That's very interesting. Very cool to know. So let me ask you this last question. What would you say to teachers about the language demands, reading, writing, discussions, etc., of your particular job? So what are some things that you would want teachers to be aware of so that as they're educating students, they're conscious about this and in motivating students and in instructing them and in a way preparing them?
I wouldn't. I don't know if it's possible, certainly, to cover every industry, but it certainly should be. It would be nice if you could take a few days, a few weeks in a course, over the course of a course, and basically bring in some technical manuals, introduce whether it's the medical field, the technical field, or whatever, and say, here is what you may find. And then taking a page out of a technical manual or an industry journal, and saying, now I'm going to put this up, and I'm going to hand it to you, send it to you, whatever, and read it, and tell me if you can figure out what any of this means. And if the answer, my guess is the answer for most people would be, I have no idea what they're talking about. And I think a teacher could then, calm their fears about that by saying, what you're looking at now, outside of the normal English language, is something you are likely to see once you're out in the world, because of all the different businesses and all their different jargons that they use.
Okay, yeah.
And I think that they could ease their fears, maybe get them at least used to the idea that once they're out in the world, what they see may resemble English, but isn't. You know, it is.
Yeah.
You know, because it's going to be so custom.
Sure.
And so I think that that's basically a service. I think that's almost a public service that you could do for students, and so that they're not, it doesn't seem as daunting once they hit that. Explain to them that, like, with some patience and mentoring and time and listening and questions, that it's almost like a foreign language, that pretty soon, a few days, a few weeks, don't be impatient.
Mm-hmm.
Work at it, keep listening, keep reading,
Sure.
learn that word A actually equals word B in this
Mm-hmm.
industry, and go from there.
And
I think that would be very helpful.
and perhaps pushing them towards their interests. You know, as you mentioned, is allowing them to explore something that motivates them, that could give them some initiative in their career, in finding those articles or that content that they could then read. And even though it could be a technical manual or something a little bit more text or vocabulary heavy, that they could have that motivation to get through it, because you know they want to become you know, whatever they want to become, they aspire to become in their careers.
Yeah.
I know that one of the strategies that Dr. Diane Lapp really pushes for is the close reading, is grabbing small chunks of text and diving into it piece by piece, and allowing students to really analyze the text and pull information from it without having to be, you know, so overwhelmed by an extremely long piece of text. So.
Hmm. Yeah.
Very cool. Paul, do you mind sharing with us some of the shows that you are currently working on, or perhaps some of the shows that you're really, really proud of,
Sure.
and some of the awards perhaps that you've received? I know that you have been a recipient, or your shows have been a recipient of some awards as well.
Yes. The Star Trek franchise I worked on for 15 years, starting with Next Generation through the very end of Star Trek Enterprise, and I was fortunate enough to be nominated for 12 Emmys, and I won 3.
Wow.
The show won many, many more. Then, after Star Trek, I worked on Lost, which was a show I loved, which was so that's one of the highlights for me. It's always a bonus when you love the show you work
Yeah.
on and actually can't wait to see it, you know, when it aired. Lost was like that for me. I worked on Pushing Daisies, CSI Miami. Um, Recently, I worked on True Blood for HBO, then Banshee for HBO. We're starting to work on Veep next season,
Ah,
season 5 of
very
Veep.
cool.
Just finished season 1 of Narcos
Ah.
on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
That was exciting because that was our first, my first. It wasn't the company's first, but we've gone from standard definition to high definition to now 4K
Ah.
video, and that was my first 4K show. So everything is moving to a higher and higher resolution.
Yeah.
See, now we're having a conversation where a layperson, if they were eavesdropping, might go, "What is
Sure.
this
What?
K's
Yeah.
standard definition, high definition? It's just television." But it was quite an experience to work in 4K. It slows everything down and has to be,
Wow.
you know, it just it takes a long time to render. Um, and yeah, and that's about it. I've worked on feature films, and I also work on feature film trailers for television and theatrical release. I've also worked in restoration. I've worked on films like Chinatown and Lawrence of Arabia,
Oh,
and
wow.
many, many others to restore them from the original film. Visual effects has become a big part of restoring film because we have techniques that we've developed over the years that restoration people may not have heard of or thought of to use, and we apply those techniques to restoring feature films, old feature films, and it's been very successful. Yeah.
Paul, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking, you know, time out of your day to just let teachers know, let educators know about yourself, about your career, what has gotten you there, and some comments and perhaps some advice that they could use in their classrooms to motivate students and to instruct students into developing their literacy skills.
Sure. Yeah, it's my pleasure to do it.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Okay.